In the marble atrium of Whitmore Holdings, beneath a chandelier that cost more than most people earned in a decade, Celeste Whitmore set a rusted key on the table as if she were tossing out garbage. Shareholders watched, lawyers watched, and a handful of reporters leaned in with their cameras raised, waiting for the quiet man across from her to shrink under the weight of her contempt. She told Grady Calloway that he needed to stop clinging to his late wife's family through cheap keepsakes and sentimental theater. Grady said nothing at first. He simply looked at the key, picked it up with the same steady patience he brought to every broken lock he had ever repaired, and asked a single question that silenced the entire room. "Do you know why your father kept this for 20 years?" That night, the key would open a vault the Whitmore family had sworn, for 2 decades, did not exist. The rusted key was returned in front of everyone. But by midnight it would unlock something none of them were prepared to face. If dead-cold reversals and buried family secrets keep you hooked, hit subscribe so you don't miss where this one goes. The press conference had been billed as a celebration, a groundbreaking for the restoration of an old private banking building downtown. And Grady Calloway had only been invited because he had written letters, 3 of them over as many years, asking the Whitmore family to return something that had belonged to his wife. Nobody expected him to actually show up in his work jacket, sleeves rolled to his forearms, hands still faintly stained with the machine oil of his trade. Celeste Whitmore arrived in a charcoal suit that fit like armor, flanked by her family's longtime attorney, and she carried herself the way people do when they have never once doubted their own legitimacy. To her, Grady was a locksmith chasing a story that had gone cold 20 years earlier, a nuisance dressed up as a grieving widower, and she intended to end the matter publicly so it would never surface again. She reached into a small velvet pouch and produced the item herself, a corroded old key with a strange bit pattern that no hardware store in the country would recognize anymore, and she held it out to him the way a person holds out a napkin they no longer need. "This does not open so much as a broken cabinet anymore," she said, loud enough for the cameras, and she suggested, not unkindly but not gently either, that Grady Calloway find something better to do with his afternoons than harass a family that had already given him more patience than he deserved. Dawson Vale, the family's attorney, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile from where he stood near the podium. A few shareholders murmured to one another, amused, and 2 security guards positioned themselves near the exit as if they expected to escort a beggar out of a wedding. Grady did not raise his voice. He did not reach for anger the way a lesser man might have, the way the room seemed to be hoping he would, because a man losing his composure in public makes for an easy story and an easier dismissal. Instead, he asked her, plainly, whether she was certain this was truly what her family wanted returned to him. Celeste answered that Whitmore Holdings did not keep garbage, and that whatever sentimental value the key once carried had rusted away along with everything else from that era. Grady slipped the key into his jacket pocket, glanced up past her shoulder at the towering brass Whitmore emblem mounted on the wall behind the podium, and said quietly, almost gently, that by tonight she would understand exactly why her father had hidden it for 20 years. For a moment, something flickered across Celeste's face, a hesitation too brief for the cameras to catch, but not too brief for the man watching from the mezzanine above. Benedict Whitmore, honorary chairman of the family empire, stood at the railing overlooking the atrium, and when he saw the key return to the locksmith's hand, the color drained from his face, as though someone had opened a window into a room he had spent 2 decades trying to seal shut. Reporters, sensing nothing more than a minor human interest footnote to an otherwise routine real estate announcement, quickly turned their attention back to questions about construction timelines and projected returns for the restoration project. Celeste answered those questions smoothly, her tone regaining its usual polish. The small, unsettled moment from a few minutes earlier folded neatly back beneath her professional composure. Dawson Vale guided her gently away from the podium once the cameras began to lose interest, murmuring something about how well she had handled an awkward situation, though his own eyes kept drifting toward the mezzanine where Benedict stood. By the time the atrium emptied and the marble floor echoed once more with silence, Benedict had already descended the staircase and disappeared through a private corridor without a word to anyone, a departure so unlike his usual habit of lingering to shake hands and accept compliments that even the building's longtime staff noticed the difference. Celeste, gathering her notes near the podium, glanced once toward the door through which Grady Calloway had exited, and felt an inexplicable unease settle over her, the kind that refuses to be reasoned away simply because the day's business had technically concluded without incident. To understand why a rusted key could unsettle a man like Benedict Whitmore, it helps to understand the life of the man now carrying it. Grady Calloway lived in a modest house on the edge of a Pennsylvania suburb, the kind of place with a porch that needed painting and a garage converted into a small workshop full of drill bits, tension wrenches, and antique safe mechanisms nobody else in town still knew how to repair. He was a single father, and though his son appeared only briefly in the story, through a short phone call reminding him not to be late for dinner, that single call said everything about the kind of quiet, careful life Grady had built after everything else had been taken from him. 20 years earlier, Grady had been a young systems engineer for Keystone Private Bank, responsible for maintaining the mechanical vault infrastructure before Keystone was absorbed into what would eventually become Whitmore Holdings. The night before the merger was finalized, a set of trust documents vanished from the building, an event that triggered an internal panic and an urgent need for someone to blame. Grady, as the last person recorded checking the vault systems, became that someone. He lost his job, his reputation, and any chance of proving otherwise, because the bank that absorbed Keystone had no interest in reopening a wound that made its own acquisition look messy. His wife, Lena Calloway, had worked as a junior accountant for the Whitmore Trust Division at the time, and she never once believed the official story that pinned the missing documents on her husband. She spent years quietly gathering scraps of information she was never meant to see, though she rarely spoke of it aloud, perhaps to protect Grady from a fight she suspected they could not yet win. Before she passed away, she left behind a handful of notes that made little sense on their own, phrases like Vault B17, a rusted key, and a single name underlined twice, Benedict. Grady remembered those early years less as a single catastrophe and more as a slow erosion, the kind that wears a man down without ever announcing itself as ruin. First came the whispers among former colleagues, the way people who once shook his hand at company gatherings suddenly found reasons to avoid eye contact in grocery store aisles. Then came the harder blow, the inability to find comparable work anywhere in the region, because no bank wanted to hire the engineer whose name had been quietly, unofficially, attached to a scandal that never made the newspapers but somehow reached every hiring manager within driving distance. He took work fixing residential locks, then commercial safes, then slowly built a reputation as a craftsman who understood mechanisms other people had long since forgotten how to repair, a reputation built one careful job at a time rather than through any grand vindication. Lena never stopped believing him, not for a single day, and that certainty became the quiet foundation. Grady leaned on through years when almost nothing else in his life offered proof that the truth still mattered. She would come home from her position at the trust division with a strange, distracted look, the kind of expression a person wears when they have seen something they cannot yet explain and are not certain they are allowed to repeat it. She never told him everything, not because she doubted him, but because she understood, long before he did, exactly how far the Whitmore family's reach could extend into the lives of people who tried to speak against them. When she became ill, years later, she spent her final months organizing rather than resting, sorting through old paperwork with the quiet urgency of someone who understood her time for finishing the work was running short. She never explained the full meaning behind Vault B17, and Grady, respecting whatever fear had kept her silent for so long, never pushed her to explain more than she offered. It was only after her passing that he began, slowly and without any clear plan, piecing together the fragments she had left behind, treating each scrap of paper the way he treated a stubborn lock, patiently, methodically, without ever assuming the answer would come quickly. For years afterward, Grady lacked anything resembling proof, and he never tried to force the issue through noise or confrontation, which was never his nature to begin with. Instead, he worked patiently in the background, collecting old blueprints from retired colleagues, cross-referencing mechanical schematics, requesting archived banking records through channels that took months to yield anything at all, and holding on to scraps of paperwork the merger lawyers had simply forgotten to shred. The rusted key that Celeste had just handed back to him in front of cameras was, in truth, the final piece of an old deadbolt system, a backup mechanism for a vault that had technically been erased from every merger document filed 20 years before. That evening, in the quiet of his workshop, Grady opened a small wooden box that had belonged to Lena, laying the key gently beside a folded note in her handwriting. Vault B17 is not dead, the note read. It was only ever renamed. The morning after the press conference, Celeste found herself irritated in a way she could not fully explain, replaying Grady's parting words long after she should have forgotten them entirely. She instructed Dawson Vale to quietly review the historical property records tied to the old Keystone Private Bank building, telling herself it was simple due diligence rather than an admission that something in the locksmith's question had rattled her composure. Dawson, ever the family's fixer, assured her that Grady Calloway had a well-documented history of filing baseless grievances against Whitmore Holdings, letters that legal counsel had reviewed and dismissed years ago as the ramblings of a man who had never accepted responsibility for his own mistakes. Despite Dawson's reassurances, Celeste noticed something odd buried within the merger archive, a sub-basement level of the old Keystone building that had officially been recorded as filled in and sealed for structural reasons 2 decades ago, yet the original architectural blueprints still showed a corridor extending toward an auxiliary vault chamber. It was a small inconsistency, the kind that most executives would never bother chasing, but Celeste had built her career on noticing details other people overlooked. She brought the discrepancy to her father, expecting a simple explanation that would put the matter to rest. Instead, Benedict dismissed her almost too quickly, waving a hand as though the subject bored him, insisting it was ancient history unworthy of her attention. The speed of his dismissal was itself unsettling, because Benedict Whitmore was not a man who brushed aside details without reason. He was a man who controlled every narrative that touched his family's name. He told Celeste in a tone that left no room for negotiation to cut off all contact with the locksmith immediately, and he quietly instructed Dawson to handle Grady Calloway through what he called a discreet settlement, the kind of arrangement designed to make inconvenient people disappear from a story without leaving fingerprints. Celeste maintained her composure outwardly, the same cool poise the family had trained into her since childhood, but privately something had shifted. She had grown up believing the Whitmore empire had been built on discipline, intelligence, and old-fashioned diligence. The story her father told at every shareholder dinner and every charity gala. If that story were entirely true, she found herself wondering, why would a rusted, decades-old key send her father into such visible alarm? That evening, an unmarked envelope arrived at her office, slid beneath the door by someone who had clearly wanted no record of the delivery. Inside was a photocopied document bearing Lena Calloway's signature, describing in careful and deliberate language how certain client trust assets had been quietly transferred out of Whitmore Trust without proper authorization 2 decades earlier. Dawson Vale arrived at Grady's workshop the following afternoon, choosing charm over threat, the way a man accustomed to buying silence always does. He carried with him a folder and, tucked inside it, a check large enough to make most people's hands shake, along with a document requiring Grady's signature confirming that any accusations against the Whitmore family were nothing more than an unfortunate misunderstanding. Dawson believed, quite genuinely, that a man who repaired locks for a living and raised a son alone would jump at the sight of that number. Grady declined without raising his voice, setting the folder back on the workbench between them as calmly as he might set down a finished repair. Dawson smiled the practiced smile of a man used to getting his way, remarking that someone in Grady's position could not realistically hope to win against a family with lawyers, banks, and the press all comfortably in their pocket. Then, almost gently, Dawson added that continuing to dig through the past might also stir up questions about Lena's own conduct during her time at the trust division, a threat wrapped so carefully in politeness that it barely sounded like one at all. It was, in its own way, the sharpest moment of contempt in the entire encounter, because Dawson assumed a poor man would always bow before enough zeros on a check. Grady reached into his own bag and produced a small recorder, perfectly legal under state law since the conversation was taking place in his own shop, along with a photocopy of a letter Dawson himself had written to Keystone decades earlier, a letter instructing staff to seal the auxiliary vault before an incoming audit. Dawson's practiced composure finally cracked. Grady told him plainly that he had no interest in the money, only in seeing a particular door opened in front of an independent attorney as a witness. Dawson tried a different approach then, softening his tone, suggesting that a man raising a son alone should think practically rather than sentimentally, that pride did not pay for school tuition or medical bills, and that the offer on the table would not remain generous forever. Grady's expression did not change, though something in his voice grew firmer, and he said that he had already spent 20 years watching what happened to a family that tried to buy its way out of the truth, and he had no intention of teaching his son the same lesson by accepting a smaller version of the same bargain. Dawson attempted to gather his folder and leave with what remained of his composure, insisting that Grady would regret refusing an offer this generous, that people who chased shadows in old buildings usually found nothing but disappointment and legal bills for their trouble. It was at that exact moment that Celeste stepped into the doorway, having followed Dawson there out of a suspicion she had not yet named even to herself, and she heard enough of the exchange to understand that Grady Calloway was not inventing a story out of thin air. Dawson froze mid-sentence at the sight of her, the confident polish draining from his posture in an instant, and for the first time Celeste saw her family's longtime attorney look genuinely afraid of being caught rather than merely inconvenienced. Before she left, Grady set the rusted key back down on the workbench and looked directly at her. "You returned this to humiliate me," he said, "but you may have just handed back the only thing that can save you from your own family." Celeste agreed, reluctantly, to accompany Grady to the old Keystone building now sitting at the center of the Whitmore Restoration Project, though she insisted on bringing an independent attorney and a licensed structural technician to ensure everything proceeded within the bounds of the law. The subbasement smelled of dust and cold concrete, untouched for years, and several sections had clearly been walled off long after the original construction, the new brick just faintly different in tone from the surrounding stone. Grady moved through the space with quiet familiarity, pointing out a ventilation duct that no longer matched the original blueprints, a patch of mortar too fresh for its supposed age, and old maintenance markings that had been deliberately painted over. Celeste found herself watching him differently than she had at the press conference, no longer seeing a bitter man clinging to old grievances, but someone who carried the entire architecture of this place in his memory without ever needing to boast about it. Every step he took seemed to follow a purpose she could not yet see, guided by 20 years of quiet study rather than any sudden inspiration. When they reached a section of wall that felt subtly hollow beneath the attorney's knock, Grady asked for a moment, running his palm along an old seam in the brick until his fingers found what he was looking for. The independent attorney, a careful woman named Harriet Doyle, who had been retained precisely because she owed nothing to either family involved, documented every step with a small recorder and a notepad, insisting that nothing about this discovery could later be dismissed as staged or convenient. She asked Grady repeated questions about how he could be so certain of measurements and markings from a building he had not set foot in for 2 decades, and each time he answered simply, explaining some small technical detail about mechanical tolerances or structural code that made his knowledge sound less like memory and more like fluency, in a language most people had never bothered to learn. Celeste noticed that his answers never wavered, never contradicted themselves, and never once sounded rehearsed for effect, which unsettled her far more than if he had stumbled. At one point, the structural technician accompanying them flagged a section of ductwork that had been rerouted in a way that made no logical sense for ventilation purposes, running instead toward a dead space the current blueprints claimed did not exist. Grady explained, without being asked, that the rerouting matched a common technique used decades earlier to disguise a secondary chamber from casual inspection, allowing air circulation into a space officially recorded as filled with concrete. Celeste found herself standing very still as she absorbed the implication that someone had gone to considerable trouble not simply to seal a room, but to make certain the room could remain habitable for storage indefinitely, hidden in plain sight beneath a building her own family now owned. Harriet asked Grady how he had first learned the exact location of the hidden corridor, and he admitted, with the same even tone he used for everything, that Lena's old notes had included a rough hand-drawn diagram, water-damaged and difficult to read, but paired with his own knowledge of the original mechanical layout, it had been enough to narrow the search considerably. Celeste asked to see the diagram, and Grady produced a small folded paper from an inner pocket, careful and worn from handling, showing her Lena's handwriting for the first time. Seeing another woman's careful, determined penmanship laid bare in front of her own eyes made the entire situation feel suddenly less abstract, less like corporate history, and more like a private grief that had been carried in silence for 20 years while her own family continued attending galas and issuing shareholder letters as though nothing beneath their feet required examining. Behind the false wall stood a heavy steel door, old enough that it bore no modern handle at all, only a corroded mechanical lock built for a key exactly like the one Celeste had once tossed across a conference table as though it were worthless. She watched Grady slide the key into the mechanism, and for a long, breathless moment it seemed to catch, refusing to turn, and she almost allowed herself to feel a flicker of relief that the whole ordeal might end there in quiet failure. But Grady adjusted the angle by memory alone, applying pressure in the same rhythm the old lock had once required, engaging a hidden secondary latch buried beneath the surface, and the door groaned open after 2 decades of silence. Inside, there was no gold, no jewelry, none of the theatrical treasure a lesser story might have promised. Instead, there were rows of document boxes, reel-to-reel audio tapes, ledgers bound in cracked leather, and a smaller secondary safe stamped with the engraved words Whitmore Family Trust. The documents inside told a story far uglier than either of them had expected. 20 years earlier, before Whitmore Holdings acquired Keystone Private Bank, A trust fund belonging to dozens of ordinary families had been quietly redirected into a network of shell companies controlled by the Whitmore family. The transfers dressed up in enough legal language to survive a cursory audit. The missing documents from that fateful night had never truly disappeared. They had simply been moved down here, buried beneath a false wall, so the theft could be reclassified as an accounting anomaly rather than a crime. Lena Calloway had discovered the irregularity while working in the trust division, quietly copying portions of the original ledger and hiding them here rather than risk immediate exposure without support behind her. Grady had been the easiest person to sacrifice, the engineer with legitimate access to every vault system in the building, and once he was gone, no one in a position of power had any reason to keep listening. Celeste found her own father's signature scattered across the internal memoranda, authorizing what the documents euphemistically called an asset restructuring initiative, and beside it, in a firmer hand, the signature of her grandmother, Marjorie Whitmore, approving the original order to seal the auxiliary vault. Tucked among the ledgers was a sealed letter addressed simply to Grady, written in Lena's careful handwriting. She had written that if the key ever found its way back into his hands, it would mean the truth still had one last chance to see daylight. She had not wanted him to answer cruelty with cruelty, only to make certain that the people holding power were finally forced to return what they had taken. Celeste stood in the cold vault feeling the ground shift beneath the story she had always believed about her own family, torn between the instinct to protect an empire and the growing certainty that protecting it any longer would make her no different from the people who had built it on someone else's ruin. It was at that moment that Benedict appeared at the entrance of the vault, Dawson trailing a step behind him, his face unreadable in the dim light. He did not deny anything outright. He only looked at his daughter and said quietly that she did not understand the price required to keep an empire standing. Benedict tried, in the hours that followed, to frame the entire episode as a necessary act of survival rather than theft, insisting that the redirected trust funds had saved Keystone during a financial crisis that would otherwise have wiped out thousands of ordinary depositors. He argued that if the truth were made public now, it would cost countless employees their jobs, wipe out shareholder value overnight, and permanently stain the Whitmore name beyond any hope of repair. Grady listened without interrupting, then asked a single question that Benedict had clearly never expected anyone to ask aloud. If the decision had truly been the right one, why had it required blaming a young engineer and letting his wife live the rest of her life isolated and unheard? Benedict had no answer for that. Dawson, sensing the silence stretching too long, offered what he considered a reasonable path forward, proposing that the vault be resealed quietly, that Grady receive a private settlement far larger than anything offered before, that a handful of internal records be adjusted, and that Celeste simply continue running the company as though nothing had ever been found. It was, in many ways, the greatest temptation Celeste had faced in her entire adult life, an offer that would let her keep everything she had been raised to protect. Grady could have released the evidence immediately, could have ended the Whitmore family's carefully constructed legacy without asking anyone's permission, but he chose instead to place the decision squarely in Celeste's hands. "You returned a rusted key to me in front of a crowded room," he told her, "and now you have the chance to return the truth in front of an even larger one." Celeste thought back to the press conference, to the practiced disdain in her own voice as she had dismissed him as a nuisance clinging to sentiment, and she felt, for the first time, the full weight of having used her family's language to belittle an innocent man. That night, alone in her office long after the rest of the building had emptied, Celeste read through the ledgers a second time, then a third, searching for some detail that might soften what she had already understood on the first reading. She found none. Instead, she found additional names, Families whose modest trust accounts had been quietly diminished over years through transfers dressed up in language so bureaucratic it seemed designed specifically to discourage anyone from asking questions. She recognized a few of the family names from charity dinners her own father had hosted, people who had once shaken Benedict's hand and thanked him for his generosity, never suspecting that a portion of what had funded that generosity had been taken from accounts bearing their own signatures. She thought about her grandmother, Marjorie, who had always struck her as gentle in a distant, formal way, more concerned with proper table settings than with boardroom decisions. Discovering Marjorie's signature on the sealing order forced Celeste to reconsider every quiet moment of her childhood spent in that woman's parlor, every soft-spoken piece of advice about family loyalty that had, in hindsight, sounded less like wisdom and more like conditioning. She wondered how many other people in her family's orbit, lawyers, accountants, junior executives long since retired, had known some fragment of the truth and simply decided it was safer, easier, more profitable to look away. By the time morning arrived, Celeste had made her decision, though it cost her something to admit that the choice itself had never truly been difficult, only frightening. She understood that protecting the family name any longer would not preserve anything worth preserving. It would only extend the same quiet betrayal that had already cost Grady 2 decades of his life and cost Lena the chance to see her own name cleared while she still lived to witness it. She thought, too, of her own reputation, of the years she had spent building a version of herself she believed was fair and clear-eyed, and she understood that continuing to protect Benedict's decision would quietly undo every claim she had ever made about deserving her position on merit rather than inheritance. She drafted her remarks for the coming meeting slowly, discarding several early versions that leaned too heavily on corporate language, phrases that softened the truth into something more palatable for shareholders accustomed to comfortable reassurances. Each time she caught herself reaching for that kind of language, she thought of Grady standing quietly in her father's office, refusing every attempt to be bought, and she forced herself instead toward plainer words, words that could not later be reinterpreted or diluted by lawyers looking for an exit. By the time she finished, the speech felt less like a strategic statement and more like an apology that had been 2 decades overdue. She called Dawson first, informing him that the emergency board meeting he had proposed would happen exactly as planned, though not remotely in the way he expected. By the next morning, Celeste had called an emergency meeting of the board, insisting that every senior member appear in the very atrium where she had once handed Grady the key as though disposing of trash. Benedict arrived that morning fully convinced his daughter would ultimately choose to protect the family name, the way every Whitmore before her had chosen when tested. Board members, major shareholders, and a rotating group of journalists filled the atrium under the pretense of another update on the Keystone Restoration Project, while Dawson quietly prepared remarks designed to frame Grady as an opportunist attempting to extort the family. Grady walked into the atrium in the same worn jacket he had worn days earlier, and a few shareholders exchanged amused glances, assuming the locksmith had returned once more, hat in hand, hoping for money. Celeste took the podium beneath the towering brass Whitmore emblem, and for a moment she spoke exactly the way her father expected her to, describing the family legacy, the discipline behind generations of careful stewardship, the trust the Whitmore name had earned across decades. Benedict allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, believing his daughter was simply closing the chapter the way the family always closed uncomfortable chapters, with polished language and unwavering unity. Then Celeste reached into her jacket and placed the rusted key on the podium in full view of every camera in the room. She told the room, plainly and without theatrical flourish, that the key had opened a vault her family had hidden for 20 years, and that inside it were records proving client trust assets had been improperly redirected, that an entire vault had been sealed away before an audit, and that an innocent engineer named Grady Calloway had been blamed for a crime he never committed. Dawson attempted to interject, warning that this kind of reckless disclosure would destroy the company from within, but Celeste calmly informed the room that copies of every document had already been delivered to an independent auditing firm, a financial regulatory body, and outside legal counsel, leaving no room left for the matter to quietly disappear. A murmur spread through the shareholders, some reaching for their phones, others simply staring at Benedict as though seeing him for the first time in years of quarterly dinners and polite handshakes. One older board member, a man who had sat on the Whitmore board since before Celeste was born, rose slowly from his chair and asked, in a voice thick with disbelief, whether the families named in those documents had ever been told what happened to their money. Celeste answered honestly that they had not until this very morning, and that correcting that silence would now be the company's first order of business regardless of what it cost the balance sheet. There was no shouting from Grady, no dramatic demand for vengeance, only the plain, unavoidable weight of truth settling over a room that had built its comfort on looking away. Celeste turned toward him in front of everyone and said that she had once handed him back the wrong kind of key, and that today she intended to return something far more valuable, his name. Benedict rose from his seat without a word, his expression frozen, and for the first time in his life he found himself standing in a room he could not command into silence. He looked at his daughter for a long moment, searching her face for some sign of doubt he might still exploit, some crack in her resolve he could widen with a familiar reminder of loyalty or legacy. He found none. Whatever hold he had once maintained over the direction of this family had quietly transferred, sometime between the rusted key and this very morning, into hands steadier than his own had ever truly been, and he walked out of the atrium through the same private corridor he had used days earlier, though this time no one mistook his departure for anything other than what it was. In the weeks that followed, Whitmore Holdings absorbed the kind of crisis few companies survive intact, its share price sliding, headlines multiplying, board members quietly distancing themselves from decisions made decades before some of them had even joined the company. Celeste did not retreat from the wreckage. Instead, she stepped forward to personally oversee the resulting investigation and the long process of repayment owed to the families whose trust funds had been taken. Benedict was removed from every remaining position of influence within the company, his honorary titles stripped in a vote the board no longer feared to hold. Dawson Vale was suspended from his role as legal counsel pending a formal inquiry into his own involvement, his practiced charm suddenly useless against a paper trail bearing his own signature. Marjorie Whitmore, when finally questioned directly, admitted quietly that she had known about the vault for years, but had chosen silence rather than risk watching the family she loved unravel from within. It was a small human confession that complicated the story rather than simplifying it, a reminder that not everyone involved had been cruel by nature, only cowardly by choice, and that cowardice alone had been enough to crush an innocent man's life. Grady was formally cleared of any wrongdoing tied to the disappearance of the original trust documents. 2 decades earlier, his employment record corrected, and Lena's name entered permanently into the public account as the person who first uncovered the irregularity. Celeste personally offered Grady a substantial settlement in recognition of what the family had cost him, and while he did not refuse it outright, he asked that the majority of it be redirected into a restitution fund for the families whose money had originally been taken. He kept only enough to secure a stable future for himself and his son, unwilling to let money become the point of a story that had never truly been about money at all. Celeste once asked him why he had not simply destroyed the Whitmore family the moment he held the evidence in his hands, when he had every justified reason to do so. He told her, simply, that Lena had never wanted him to become the kind of person who mistook power for justice. Months later, the old Keystone building had been transformed into a public archive and restitution center, a place where the families once harmed by the hidden trust fund could review their own records and reclaim what remained recoverable. Celeste voluntarily relinquished a portion of her family's controlling authority, restructuring Whitmore Holdings around new standards of transparency that her father would never have tolerated. Grady reopened his own small workshop, no longer the quiet man crushed beneath an old injustice, but someone whose name people spoke with respect rather than suspicion. The families who had once lost portions of their trust accounts began arriving at the restitution center in a steady, quiet stream, many of them elderly now, some accompanied by children who had grown up hearing vague, half-understood stories about money that had simply disappeared decades earlier. Celeste made a point of meeting with as many of them personally as her schedule allowed, listening to accounts of hardship that no boardroom summary could ever fully capture, moments when a missing sum had meant a canceled surgery, a lost home, a delayed education. She kept a private notebook of these conversations, not for any public relations purpose, but because she felt she owed each family the simple dignity of being heard by someone bearing her family's name. Benedict, stripped of his titles and largely avoided by former colleagues who had once courted his approval, spent his remaining years in a quieter version of the life he had always resisted, a life without podiums or shareholder applause. Celeste visited him occasionally, though their conversations remained strained, neither able to fully bridge the distance between what he had done and what she now represented. He never offered the apology she privately hoped for, though once, near the end, he admitted quietly that he had spent 20 years telling himself the lie was a form of protection, and that watching Grady stand in that boardroom, without a trace of vengeance in his voice, had been the moment he finally stopped believing his own excuse. A small plaque now hung inside the Keystone archive, engraved simply with Lena's name and a single line beneath it. She kept the truth alive when every door around her had been locked. Celeste visited the workshop one afternoon, dressed far more plainly than the polished executive who had once tossed a rusted key across a conference table, carrying that same key now cleaned and mounted inside a small glass case. She asked Grady whether he wanted to keep it for himself. Grady told her the key no longer belonged only to him. It belonged to everyone who had ever been forced into silence by people who assumed they would never be believed. Celeste placed the case at the center of the new Keystone archive, where it remained as a quiet symbol that buried truths do not vanish, they only wait. The story closes on Grady walking once more through the same atrium that had once stripped him of everything he had, and this time no one laughed, no one signaled for security, no one dared to look away, because every door in that building finally stood open, not for money, and not for power, but simply because the truth had, at last, found its key.
God damn. God damn. I'm dead. There we go. Shit, I'm dead. You got me. Yeah, good game. Yeah, I knew. Never say never. No, you can't see my health bar on the left side. That was a wrap. That was a wrap. Oh shit. You gotta be optimistic? I am optimistic, bro, but trust me, that one was cooked. I know when I'm cooked, bro. Sometimes you can save it, but that it was literally here, bro. I was like, there's if I got tapped, oh shit, I'm dead. Literally.